plantation culture and just kind of the lifestyle in the South. Now, we are all familiar with this idea of King Cotton, and I'm afraid I might have my animation screwed up here. Okay, yeah, that moved out of the way. Good, okay. King Cotton is, whenever we actually start fighting the war, there's going to be a war strategy of the South called King Cotton. But King Cotton, this is just the #1 cash crop in the South, and this is what those wealthy plantation owners are making their money off of. And then, of course, they're selling it to the textile mills up north, and the owners of those textile factories are making a ton of money off of the cotton, and then all of that is happening on the backs of the enslaved people that are working the fields. All right, so King Cotton. And again, this is something that I think is very important, and it kind of goes to that BBQ we've been looking at as well, is how the cotton industry is going to connect the northern and southern economies. And in that document 7, you had Frederick Douglass talking about, how people ought to vote, how working class people who work in those textile factories ought to vote. And he was basically calling the North out for supporting slavery. Even though the North, they were free states, Douglass would say that, no, you support slavery because you are supporting these cotton industries in the North. The South, as in the southern United States, will produce over half of the world's supply of cotton in the run-up to the American Civil War. Cotton will account for more than half of all U.S. exports. So the U.S. economy was heavily reliant on cotton production. So all the U.S. economy was rather heavily reliant on enslaved labor. And Britain, in particular, was our #1 buyer. The British had tons of textile factories as well, and most of the cotton that they are using in their textile factories is coming from the American South. So this is an important little tidbit because this gives the South what they think is leverage. When the war starts, maybe the South can get some foreign allies, right? Great Britain is relying on Southern cotton. Maybe Great Britain will help the South out in the war. That's the idea. It don't happen. But that's what the South is kind of counting on. So this planters or this plantation lifestyle, this plantation is actually one you can go visit. It's known as 12 Oaks. It is outside of, I believe, New Orleans. It's in southern Louisiana. And this picture is from the famous Civil War movie Gone with the Wind. And you got the heroine Scarlett O'Hara, who is an enslaver, and how her plantation kind of survives through the Civil War. All right, this word, antebellum, we're going to see this quite a bit. Antebellum just means before the war, okay, before the war, antebellum, before the war. So the picture that people had of the American South was everybody owns a plantation, everybody lives like Scarlett O'Hara and just is, just frivolous and just does nothing for themselves. Enslaved labor does everything for them. The reality is that most Southerners are poor subsistence farmers. There is a small merchant class, and there are a few southern cities, but a lot of those cities are based on the cotton trade. Charleston is a large southern city, and it, of course, is an exporting city. Same thing with Savannah. A lot of the cotton produced in the interior South will go through these southern cities and be exported out. Only a quarter of southern families were enslavers. So, percentage-wise, not many. And then even out of these 25% of all families, most of them were not big plantation owners. They owned between 1 to 4 enslaved people, and they still were rather small farmers, not wealthy at all. Probably all of their wealth was tied up in the value of those enslaved people. So when we're talking about how many of these large plantations were there, you're looking at only about 2% of the southern population would qualify as these large plantations or these large planters. And it was this 2% that will control the southern states politically, economically, everything. So whenever we're talking about southern politics worked more like an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is whenever a few rich people really controls the mechanisms of government. Yeah, there's elected officials. But those elected officials know who pays for them. And it's these rich planters. There's been lots of articles lately about, how, to what extent is the United States of America currently an oligarchy? With a few wealthy corporations or individuals really kind of running things behind the scenes. And that's just way too depressing to think about. I don't even want to think about that. There were free black people in the South. And most of the free black people in the South did live in the few cities and were well established and well recognized within the community, which gave them some safety. Also, free black people could just be, have a regular job on anybody else's farm. An artisan would be a skilled laborer like a carpenter, a blacksmith, a wheelwright, a cabinet maker, just people that have the skills to make things from scratch. And also black people in some cities and in some states were allowed to own property, but not everywhere. So how did you become a free black person? The most common way somebody became free who was formerly enslaved is that during the American Revolution, they earned their freedom somehow. Sometimes that was fighting on the American side, and then the colonial governments or the new American governments awarded freedom to black soldiers who fought with the American Army. Also, the northern states at least emancipated people gradually over time to where now they're, all those northern states are free states. Some enslaved people were able to purchase their own freedom because an enslaved person could be rented out to work for for somebody else. And most of the time, the enslaved person's owner would get most of the money to rent out the labor, but a lot of times the enslaved person would get paid as well, and you could save up money and then buy your own freedom. It just depends on who the owner was, and if he or she allowed that to happen. So by 1860, there were about 4 million enslaved people in the South. But there was about 500,000 free black people in the South. Well, free black people throughout the U.S., 250,000 in the South, 250,000 in the North. So 4 million slaves and about 500,000 free blacks. So that would be about the total population. You don't need to list this. I think this is mostly intuitive. Most enslaved people were on the plantations or on small farms. So we're talking farm laborers. Some did work in cities or were skilled laborers and could be rented out. So the South, particularly the Southern plantation owners, they want to paint an image of an enslaved person being happy and enjoying their work and well treated and well fed and well clothed and well housed and taken care of like family. That was the image the South tried to portray. So you would see images like this. Folks, a community of workers with a lot of leisure time and, just having fun and enjoying life. Now, the reality, of course, is a lot different. You have, of course, harsh working conditions, very long hours, no rights, no access to education, cruel punishment for people who broke the rules, and that it could include beatings, but usually the worst punishment was either, number one, you being sold further south. They called it being sold down the river, because down the river, the further south you got, you left the cotton plantations and you got into the rice plantations, which had a reputation of being worse, the harder working conditions, or having your other family members sold away. So breaking up families was the number one punishment. If a person continually broke the rules, whether they refused to work, broke tools intentionally, things like that, ran away, they were sent to particular farms where they had a particularly mean overseer or foreperson that would break them, just beat them into submission. And of course, this is the famous picture of the enslaved person who joined up with the Union Army, and what his back looked like after so many of these beatings. So this picture of the happy slave, of course, that is absolutely Southern propaganda. And the South also tried to compare this with the factory work of, people in the factories working 16 hours a day, and that it was, it was worse than what was going on in the South, because the factory owners didn't take care of their people like family. But these plantation owners do. They don't, right? You know better. There were several slave rebellions that are worthy to talk about, because they will change things sometimes in the South. Of course, forms of rebellion took a lot of different shapes and sizes. Some were black people getting weapons to kill white people. Other forms of rebellion were just working slowly or intentionally breaking tools. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So it was just that sort of little mini rebellions that could hurt production and then could hurt the owners. This idea of the enslaved people that were working slowly, folks started talking about how all black people are lazy because look how slowly they go. Or whenever an enslaved person would just feign ignorance. Well, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to operate that piece of equipment. I don't know how that works. So then you get this idea, this stereotype of black people being dumb, right? And all of that just goes back to these little mini rebellions that were happening every day on these plantations. So sabotaging equipment, that's like breaking the tools, like I mentioned. But then there were, like, let's get some weapons and kill the white people. Big rebellions. Nat Turner's rebellion is probably the most infamous. It is in 1831 and in Virginia, and 60 white people are killed in this rebellion, and it is going to change things in the South. New laws will be passed governing what slaves can or cannot do. We got a little video here that we're going to watch, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit.
Teachers love that Prodigy Math adapts to every student's way of learning.
And it shows you exactly.
I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty.
Nat Turner was an enslaved African-American preacher who was born in 1800 and led a large-scale rebellion in 1831.
Nat Turner's ultimate goal was to end the system of slavery. He chose violence as his only option, and that option, painful and good as it was, shook up the system.
Nat Turner was a mind-blowing experience to white culture and changed the game in a fundamental way.
They vowed before they started the revolt that they would kill every white person they saw. Men, women, and children.
They were done being dehumanized, they were done being treated as property, and they just rebelled.
The rebels followed kind of a zigzag path. They stopped at most of the houses along the way, killing the slaveholders and their families who they found there.
The judgment of this court is that you are to be taken hence to jail, thence to the place of execution, and be hung by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead.
Lynching in America were spectator sports. It was spectator events. People came from miles around, and bodies were dismembered. When people went to these kinds of affairs, they wanted to take a souvenir away that proved to everybody that they were there, and that that person, that monster, is now no longer alive. How do I know that? Because I've got a piece of his body right here.
All right. Very dramatic retelling. So Nat Turner's rebellion, of course, scared the heck out of the white people. Because Nat Turner's rebellion, Nat Turner, like the video said, he was a preacher. And before this rebellion, it was allowed that enslaved people could gather on Sundays and have their own church services. And it was suspected that during these church services is when this plot, this plan, this rebellion was cooked up and planned out. And yeah, that's what happened, right? And so after Nat Turner's rebellion, and Nat Turner's captured, and several of the other rebels are captured as well, and they're all executed, heads put on spikes, and all of that. New laws are going to be passed. It's going to outlaw meetings, gatherings of black people, so no more church services. Black people cannot gather together unless they have express permission from their owners. There can be no teaching a enslaved person to read, because if they start reading and writing, then it's easier for everybody to communicate rather secretly. And since you outlaw the meetings and you outlaw the reading, hopefully this communication across farms and even within farms would stop. So you have stricter laws governing what black people can do, what enslaved people can do. Besides Nat Turner's rebellion, there was a famous slave rebellion on board a ship that is bound for Cuba. And the ship is called the Amistad. And it was a Spanish ship full of Africans, and the Spanish were taking these Africans to Cuba to sell them into slavery in the Caribbean. By this time, the Americans had outlawed the international slave trade. The Americans, we outlawed the international slave trade. I want to say it's 1809. It's 1800 something. It's when we outlawed the international slave trade. So it wasn't that these Africans were bound for America, they were bound for Cuba, but they're going to wind up in the United States. We got a short little video about this. This might be the trailer to the movie. It's a really good movie.
They were first detained by officers on the survey brig off the coast of Long Island, and only assume that the charge is murder.
We hereby claim salvage on the high seas of the Spanish ship La Amistad and all our cargo.
Here are the true owners of these slaves. These slaves, Your Honor, are by rights the property of Spain.
You and this young so-called lawyer have proven you know what they are. They're Africans. Congratulations. What you don't know is who they are.
This could take us all one more step closer to civil war.
Immediately surrender! These goods! Our president has appealed the decision to our Supreme Court. We have to try the case again.
I will call into the past and beg my ancestors to come and help me, for at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
This is the most important case ever come before this court. Because what it in fact concerns is freedom, the very nature of man. And the proof is the length to which a man will go to regain his one state. He will break loose his chains. He will decimate his enemies. He will try and try and try against all odds, against all prejudices. To get home.
So this was a movie that was made probably back in the early 2000s or maybe even in the 1990s, called the Amistad, and it is it shows the captured how the Africans were captured, how they were loaded on the slave ship. They're sailing across the Atlantic bound for Cuba, and the leader of the Africans on board, he is able to pry up a nail out of the floorboard of the ship, and with that nail, he undoes his chains, and he undoes the chains of some of his friends. And then there is a couple of boxes where they are being kept on the ship, and they open up the boxes, and there's machetes in the boxes, big long knives. So they arm themselves, they go up on deck, and they start killing people. And they leave 2 white people alive. One is the cook, and one is the captain, but he had lied and said he wasn't the captain. And they hadn't seen him before because he had been sick and kind of in his quarters throughout the whole journey. But they left 2 people alive and communicated with them, take us back home. And so the captain would steer the ship in the morning back home, back to Africa, to the slaves meant they sailed toward the rising sun, right? Because the sun rises in the east and they want to head back east to Africa. So during the daytime, the captain, he drove the ship eastward, and then after the sun went down, he would turn it away. And he thought because there were more hours without sun than there was sun, he could eventually get to what he thought would be a friendly port. And eventually he lands in like someplace in Massachusetts. So that's how much that zigzag took them away from Cuba up the American coast, and they landed in Massachusetts. And when they land in Massachusetts, the white people that were left on board were like, arrest these people for murder because they killed all of our crewmates. So initially they were on trial for murder, and then it became, well, is it okay to murder somebody if they're trying to enslave you? Is it okay to murder your captive or your captor if you were kidnapped? And so it went through the state courts, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and former President John Quincy Adams will be defending the Africans all along the way. John Quincy Adams and John Adams, out of the first 17 presidents, they are the only 2 that never were part of a slave-owning family. So John Quincy Adams defended the Africans. Eventually, the Supreme Court said that they are not guilty of murder. They do not, they have the right to kill their captors. And Spain, you don't get them back because it was a Spanish ship. So the King of Spain was saying, this is my property. You need to deliver my property to me. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no to that too. These people basically fought for their freedom and won, so there you go. Simke is like I said, the African leader, and they are given the option to either stay in Massachusetts as free black people or to go back home. And Simke and only a handful of other of the surviving Africans wanted to go back home. And the saddest part of the whole story is whenever Simke got back home, there was nothing left. Like his whole village had been destroyed. Nobody is left. Everybody else had been pretty much kidnapped and probably sold off into slavery someplace. So, out of the Amistad Rebellion, eventually they were liberated and sent to Africa. This is 1839 when this happens. And like I said, these rebellions really, really start scaring the white people in the South. They start wanting to control their slaves more strictly. And besides targeting what slaves can or can't do, laws are going to be passed about what free black people can and can't do. So some free black people were able to vote, but starting in about 1840, that's not going to be the case. Late 1830s. No black person, free or enslaved, can own weapons. They cannot testify in court. And we already talked about no meetings without supervision or permission. And in most southern states, it was illegal to teach a black person to read. Now, Frederick Douglass, he had access to books where he was, and he kind of taught himself how to read. He was supposed to be a playmate for one of the white children in the home, and that boy would read books, and Frederick Douglass just kind of, caught on to what was happening and taught himself even more. But it was illegal in most southern states to teach black people to read or write. So, the abolition movement starts getting more and more popular throughout the 1800s. It probably, of course, the Uncle Tom's Cabin is what really pushes it over the edge. But you really didn't hear a whole lot until the 1830s. The idea that, well, this is just what the South does was just kind of it. We've already talked about that. The idea that slavery is a Christian institution was other propaganda that the Southern plantation owners used. This idea that the idea of the happy slave, and we treat enslaved people like our family. That was a big piece of propaganda. But also they would, cherry pick Bible verses that mention slavery in context that it is good and okay in just the natural way of things. Again, the contrast between the happy slave to the sweatshop immigrant or the sweatshop worker in the North. This was one of your vocab words last week, I believe. Not the week before, the gag resolution, which was, we're not talking about slavery. And that was pushed by the South. Because the only talk about slavery is, when are we going to end it? That was the talk that needed to happen, but the South passed this gag resolution so that it stopped any debate about slavery in Congress for about 20 years. In the North, of course, they need that cotton. We've already talked about that. Also, bankers had given a lot of money to Southern plantation owners. Farmers usually go into debt, buying more land and more equipment, and these Southern plantation owners were going into debt, purchasing more and more enslaved people. So the Northern bankers wanted to see slavery continue and more profits happening in cotton so they could get repaid. So even though we see the North as free states, most people were not against slavery. Most people were anti-abolitionist. They wanted to keep the institution going in the South and in the North. And Northern people were not a bunch of equality folks and abolitionists. Most of them wanted to keep slavery. the changing of their minds, that happens more than anything with Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then whenever we start getting more land out west with Texas and the Mexican cession, that's whenever this debate really starts up again. We've already mentioned the Free Soil Party. We mentioned that at the end of Friday. So we're just going to run through that. And here we go. So just a couple of maps for the extension of slavery. You can see clusters on the coast. And then the spread into 1860. All right. So we've already talked about this. Already talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's take a look at this. This political cartoon made an appearance on the APUSH test. Golly. I was still down in Graves County, so it's been a while. And it threw people for a loop. Holy cow. It actually was on a DBQ, and it was very misunderstood. So let's see what we can deduce here. So we got the caption, forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler.
Is that supposed to be?
It could be Lincoln, but he is a free soiler, so that means, you know, the free soiler is abolitionist. No slavery. Everybody ought to be free. And who's holding him down over here? And you don't need like the names of these people, but who do they represent? Say it again.
Democrats.
Yeah, they are standing on the Democratic platform, so they are with the Democratic Party, so they are holding down the free soiler. And who's this guy? Yeah, an enslaved person, and so slavery is being forced down the throat of the free soiler, and he is saying, murder, help neighbors help, oh my poor wife and children. So, would you say that a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery person made this up? Anti-slavery person. So, why would we think it would be an anti-slavery piece of propaganda? And you're right.
It just seems like they're like sort of
They're like-
forcing it, like pushing it on. And
Maybe
saying it's bad, like.
Yes. The caption here, we're supposed to feel bad for this guy. Murder, my poor wife and children.
Maybe by this they're trying to make a free soil like silent. He's not able to talk because.
Okay, yeah, so they're trying to gag him, right? Trying to make him silent by stuffing his mouth. I like that. So they're trying to shut up the free soiler, and they're holding him down and forcing slavery down his throat. Now, what do we know about what's going on over here? Bloody Kansas, right? So what is happening in Kansas to make it bloody?
They're voting to be free.
Yeah, voting, popular sovereignty. Going to be free, going to be slave, and if they vote slave, then you're doing this, maybe not to the majority of the people in Kansas, but to some people in Kansas. And by the way, Cuba, Central America, you know, we were all about manifest destiny. We had our sights set on Cuba for a while. We wanted to make it a little colony as well. Colony, territory, whatever you want to say. All right, we're going to run through a couple of the pre-Civil War presidents, and we're going to look at this guy first. Franklin Pierce, 14th President of the United States. This is him right here. Handsome Frank. Yeah, that was literally his nickname, Handsome Frank. He was a good-looking guy, right? He fought in the war against Mexico. He was president whenever we start enacting this Kansas-Nebraska Act. By the way, he's a Democrat. Pro-Southern, even though he's from New Hampshire. The Democrat Party is the party of slavery. And after the Civil War, the Democrat Party is the party of white supremacy for a long time. He's such a bad president, he's not even renominated by his own party. And you gotta be really bad to not be renominated. I mean, like right now, the Democrats are renominating an 80-year-old man, right? Whether you think he's a good president or not, he's still 80 years old, for crying out loud. All right, 60 seconds on Handsome Frank.
Franklin Pierce had the nickname Handsome Frank, but his presidency, that was going too ugly. Pierce came from a political family in New Hampshire. He served a little in the U.S. House and Senate, then did a little fighting in the Mexican-American War. It wasn't a stellar resume, but in 1852, slavery was dividing the country. The Democratic Party wanted a candidate who wouldn't rock the boat and had support in the South, and Pierce was their guy. He got elected while making no big promises. He got off to a tragic start. 2 months before his inauguration, Pierce and his family were involved in a fatal train accident in which his son was decapitated, so he was horribly depressed throughout his presidency. Although he favored the South's position on slavery, Pierce tried to put off slavery disputes a few more years by supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. It let new territories decide their own policy on slavery before becoming a state. The plan backfired, as pro- and anti-slavery militants flooded Kansas and started killing each other before that territory's vote. It was the precursor to the Civil War. Pierce had a few small wins, like buying the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico. But in 1856, he became the only elected president who was denied renomination by his party. Good looks only go so far.
And he was probably drunk throughout his whole presidency. He was a drinker anyway, but after his son was killed in that train wreck, and they literally were moving to Washington after they won the election. They were on the train moving into the White House. The train wrecks, and his son is killed. Not only killed, he is decapitated in the accident. And so he became really sloppy, drunk alcoholic throughout the 4 years of his presidency. He, you know, that was his self-medication to deal with the loss of his son. So Franklin Pierce, and I don't think we listed the date for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Do y'all, whenever you're doing notes, are you doing it on one big Google Doc or whatever? You might add a date to that, because I'm just now thinking I didn't have a date on that slide. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is 1854. 1854. You had the Compromise of 1850, which, you know, California is a free state, no slave trade in D.C., fugitive slave law. And then the next compromise was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that made popular sovereignty in Lee Smiley, Kansas. All right, here we go. In fact, this is a quote after he was not renominated. There's nothing left to do but get drunk. And I think he's only going to live like 3 more years after he leaves the White House. He basically dies of alcoholism. It's quite sad. All right, a little bit about Bleeding Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is 1854, and we're going to see Bleeding Kansas just immediately and lasting pretty much all the way to the run-up to the American Civil War. We're going to start with this video.
Slavery is the burning issue of the day. As America expands across the continent, North and South face off over each new territory. Will it be slave owning or free?
Northerners began to see that, wait a minute, they're not going to keep slavery just in the South. They want to take slavery west and to turn the country into a slave country.
and South are polarized. Neither side will back down. One man will stop at nothing to abolish slavery. John Brown, a folk hero in the North, a terrorist to the South. He thinks he's fighting a holy war. He believes himself to be God's chosen instrument. He will murder for his cause.
John Brown is one of those controversial figures about whom almost anything you can say is true. He's a terrorist in our modern terms. He's a revolutionary.
The divide between North and South is open. Kansas bleeds for 2 years. More than 200 dead. America is on the road to war. Slavery is tearing the nation apart.
America is built on a number of distinct fault lines. One, of course, was slavery and freedom. That was a fault line that had to be addressed.
In the South, slavery is a way of life, even for non-slave owners. Anti-slavery forces in the North threaten their right to decide their fate.
There is still, in some areas of America, a great pride in being Southern and holding true to the original Southern attitude. I think our clinging to the idea that slavery is a right and just way of life, it is a dark spot in our history.
Anger in the South grows more passionate every day. The North claims the moral high ground. But they are getting rich off cotton, too.
Pretty much everybody agreed that a crisis was developing. Not everyone knew that the crisis would include, in the end, a civil war, but everyone understood that a showdown between the slave South and the free North was about to occur.
Alright, so, stop there.
On the nut?
So, Bleeding, Kansas, you have over 200 people killed on either side in Bleeding, Kansas. And it is the pro-slavery versus anti-slavery, and you're basically killing the opposition before the vote. That is the purpose. They want to affect how the vote turns out, and you will either kill or intimidate the other side. There was a group known as the Border Ruffians in Missouri who tried to keep out anti-slavery people. They try to keep them out of Kansas by standing firm on that Missouri border and roughing up folks they suspected were there to promote abolition in Kansas. The Beecher's Bibles, this is a Beecher's Bible. It is a gun. Beecher is this guy, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, and he is Harriet Beecher Stowe as in Uncle Tom's Cabin. They are like cousins, they're relatives. And Reverend Beecher, this is what he says. Let's see. Well, we'll just read the whole thing. Believed that the Sharp's rifle was truly moral agency, and that there was more moral power in one of those instruments, the rifle, so far as the slaveholders of Kansas were concerned, than 100 Bibles. You might just as well read the Bible to buffaloes as to pro-slavery settlers. But they have a supreme respect for the logic that is embodied in the rifle.
So just more power.
Yeah.
In a rifle.
So, yeah, you can't reason with these people. You just gotta kill them, is kind of the idea here. Or intimidate them into going your way. So, the Beecher's Bible is not a Bible at all, because the pro-slavery people they would argue that slavery is actually a Christian institution, and they are doing their Christian duty by holding slaves. Lawrence was what was known as the free capital of Kansas, and it is going to be burned to the ground. John Brown was in Lawrence, and he tried to fight off the pro-slavery people in Lawrence, but he was ran out of the city, and the pro-slavery people burned it down. John Brown is a real interesting character. He was sitting in church one Sunday, and he said that he heard God speak to him directly and say, "John Brown, get up and stop slavery." And that's what he did. He got up, he walked out, gathered his sons, and he went to Kansas, and he went to other places to try to help enslaved people. He worked on the Underground Railroad, and then he fought in Kansas. So John Brown, he's an abolitionist. He brought his Beecher Bible, several Beecher Bibles. And this is probably the most famous painting of John Brown. And behind him is, of course, the storm of the Civil War. All right, let's make this the last thing today, the Brooks Sumner incident. So Brooks and Sumner, and this is the title slide is what this is about. Preston Brooks, he is a Democratic representative from South Carolina. He is a slave owner, and him and his family have been slave owners forever. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, he is an abolitionist. We're going to take a look at this real quick, and then we'll talk.
With Spectrum Mobile and the new Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 5 and Galaxy Z Flip 5, you get faster speeds with Spectrum Speed Boost. Order through Spectrum for up to $1,000 off, plus the value of your trade-in. SpectrumMobile.com.
Hi, my name is Matthew Ezra. I'm a historian, and here are a few things you need to know to sound smart about bleeding Kansas. The term bleeding Kansas was popularized in the 1870s by newspapers like Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. It referred to the violence that erupted in the Kansas territory in the middle of the decade. That violence was an outbreak of conflict that had emerged from the passage of the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which organized the territories in the former Louisiana Purchase under the principle of popular sovereignty, the idea that people could decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. The problem was that the doctrine of popular sovereignty didn't tell you when they could decide for themselves. So in order to decide the fate of the outcome of any referendum, forces who had an interest in the slavery issue began to rush to settle the territory. And they argued over who would govern this territory. There was a government set up that was pro-slavery in Compton, and an anti-slavery alternative government that was set up in Topeka. Republicans in Washington backed the anti-slavery forces. Democrats in Washington typically backed the pro-slavery forces. It was a standoff, and the standoff escalated into violence. Men like John Brown emerged. He was an abolitionist who had been living in Ohio, who followed his sons out to the territory and fought a kind of war with the pro-slavery forces. John Brown and his sons murdered 5 pro-slavery settlers. There was violence that erupted around the territory of Kansas in places like Washington, D.C. A senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner was nearly caned to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate by a congressman from South Carolina in the spring of 1856. Ultimately, somewhere between dozens and hundreds of people were killed in the Kansas territory during this 2-year period of sporadic violence. And ultimately, Kansas entered the Union after a long period of political standoff on the eve of the Civil War as a free state.
People in large numbers came out and joined what became known as
All right. Might have been a misplaced. It talked briefly for 5 seconds about this, but it was a good summary. You have the Preston Brooks almost beaten to death the guy from Massachusetts, Sumner. Sumner had made a speech in the Senate. Yes, because he's a representative and he's a senator. Sumner made a speech in the Senate, and he obviously was very, anti-slavery, but he actually mentioned a cousin of Preston Brooks by name, and said that he was the largest slave owner in South Carolina, and that he didn't say it outright, but he said that he is a mean, awful person who rapes the enslaved women so he can make more slave children, and he was just, it was a big speech. And obviously, Preston Brooks took offense. And Preston Brooks took his cane and went into the Senate chamber and came up behind him and started just beating him over the head with it. And beat him unconscious. And it took a while for them to get Preston Brooks off of Charles Sumner. As a result of this, Charles Sumner really never recovered. He had nowadays we would call it traumatic brain injury. Oh. And he was unable to speak clearly after the attack. And he did eventually go back into the Senate, but it was 4 years later, and he was, just not the same ever again. Now, Preston Brooks, who broke his cane in the attack, people all across the South, but particularly in South Carolina, sent him just thousands and thousands of new canes, kind of as a symbol of, you did the right thing and keep on defending slavery for us. And it just shows just how ugly it is if this happens in Congress. I don't want to go much more. Let me see where we're at here. Yeah, we're gonna save the rest for tomorrow, and let's finish up with any discussions we have over that DBQ. So I'm gonna go ahead and put our learning check up, and then we'll wrap it up with that DBQ. How is Bleeding Kansas a prelude to the American Civil War? Oh, okay. Alright. Freeze this, and I'll hurry. As y'all get those DBQs out, there's one more thing we want to do with that, and then we'll call it good. We're gonna look at another one this week and just kind of go through it as well.
You can't do that. Leave it on the regular. Let's put our hands on some things, people, so we don't do that. Sorry. Hey, you're supposed to leave it on here. 1, 2, 3. I did not cheat. No, it's like.
You're gonna be taking a test for me, and it's a DBQ test. So I'll give you a DBQ on Wednesday, and at the end of the block, you're going to hand me a beautiful essay, right? Okay, so here we go. What this whole process is about is, first of all, we look and we make sure we understand the prompt, right? And with the prompt, we're going to answer the full prompt. That's what your rubric says. Answer the full prompt. Make sure you see all parts of the question and you answer all parts of the question. The thing that some children like to do, because they think they can get away with it, is they answer a question that they have made up for themselves. And they don't like the question that's on the paper, so they answer it kind of differently.
So we're not allowed to straw man the question?
No, you're not, yeah, you have to answer what is asked. You cannot, go off over here and answer something adjacent. Yeah, you will not get credit for that. So make sure you understand what the prompt is asking and you answer the full prompt. All right, next step is you look at the documents. And as you're going through the documents, you are thinking about how they answer the question. So how they answer the prompt, how each document would support an answer to the prompt. You're thinking about HIP, what to do with the HIP on that. So as you're going through the documents, you're making notes. Now you're going to be doing the AP test in May. It is all online, and that's cool. You'll be maybe making notes on a scratch sheet of paper, perhaps. Because I'm not sure if you can actually type on, I don't think you can. I don't think there's a notes window for you. I think you just scroll through the documents. You can highlight, but all the notes you would have to do on a scrap sheet of paper. So how does that document answer the question? How can you HIP that document? And then lastly, does that document remind you of any other outside evidence that you can bring in? Okay? And the document should trigger something. Like the document 2 with the steam locomotive. You could talk about how Robert Fulton developed the steam engine and how that leads to this commercial development. In particular, first you had the steamboat, but now you have the steam engine for the locomotives. Okay? So, these 3 things, you're doing all of this while you are looking at the documents. After you do all of that, you should be able to look at this as a big picture and then come up with a thesis. And your thesis should obviously kind of be focused on the prompt. You use a lot of the same words from the prompt in your thesis. And then you give me several answers. There was a great change in society through commercial development because. And then you're listing 3 reasons why. After you come up with this thesis, then you should go ahead and start writing. Okay? So the first thing you actually write for your essay is the contextualization part. That's the start of your whole essay, is you get that contextualization point. Your thesis, so this is the first paragraph. And in the first paragraph, you have this context, and your thesis is going to be at the conclusion of that opening paragraph. So that opening paragraph, you're going to get 2 points. All right? And then next is we're going to do our body paragraphs. And we're going to do one of those right now, today. So the body paragraphs should be in the order as they are in the thesis. For instance, my 3 answers to the question in my thesis is that it changed society because people began working in factories. It created a national economy connecting North and South, and intensified the debate over slavery. That would have been my 3 answers to the question, and because I listed the people started working in factories first, my first body paragraph will be about that. Okay? So, in your body paragraph, there's a good, just little format you can follow here. First is a topic sentence, right? Where you restate your answer to the part of the question that you're answering. So my topic sentence for that first body paragraph would be people moving off the farms, or people leaving a home industry and working in factories was a big change to society in that time period. But I mentioned change to society, and I mentioned working in the factories in that topic sentence. Okay? Then, whichever document you're going to use, you put in, like, give me a document number that supports factories. 2? 6. All right. So document number 6, you're going to, that might be the first document that you use in that group. You're going to summarize it. And you're going to hip it. And we did that yesterday, right? Or Friday. We picked a document and we summarized and hipped it. Yeah? And then, what's another good factory? I got 4 for another factory one. You might need a transition word here, like similarly. I have a hard time saying that word. You know what I mean? Similarly. Similarly. Likewise. Also. But showing how these documents answer the question in a similar way. Does that make sense? That kind of, you just need that little transition word at the beginning of this summary of document 4. And then you follow the same little format. How does it answer the question? And then a hip for it as well. Document 4, oh, that's the one, it is anti-factory, child labor. It's the college minister writing home to his parents. So that works. And then you can do a closing sentence. Which, those 2, one is a pro-factory, one's kind of an anti-factory. So perhaps a closing sentence here for my first body paragraph, maybe something like, although there were different opinions on the morality of factory work, it did employ a lot of Americans and it did change society. Just kind of restate what your point is, your answer. So, between all of this, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I got about 6 sentences. Yeah? The next body paragraph, you do the same thing, but for that different group of documents. I would do how it created a national economy, connecting north to south. And then the third body paragraph would focus on slavery for me. And then I have a conclusion. That is the last. All right, so do we understand the process and perhaps the steps of how to do this? Okay. I tell you what, we got about 10 minutes. I do not care which body paragraph you want to write, but I want you to pick one body paragraph and write that whole body paragraph. Okay? We got about 10 minutes, and we'll take about 15 minutes tomorrow to wrap it up with all of this good stuff too, okay? So you can do this if you have space here, if you want to put it on a Google Doc, I don't care. Pick one of your body paragraphs and go through the process. Topic sentence.
Neither.
Summarize and hit those documents.
Yes. I want to sleep. Me too. Did you hear earlier? Did you hear?
That's your thesis, because I wasn't here that day.
Did you hear that the slaves are behaving badly because of my friends? I don't know. Okay.
I thought you were being serious for a second. No, like I thought you were actually telling me something.
Oh, yeah. No, they do though. Like.
Wait, repeat what you just said.
Okay, so basically, if you weren't here for this part, basically, if they so the forms they rebelled was working slowly, purposely breaking equipment. And so then they, the slave owner would sell them to worse places. So, and that would be the rice plantations.
The world's nice.
Who am I saying? I'm just
Ukrainians actually Ukrainians had slaves of Russians and Polish people, and then Syrians.